This is Eddie Wilson welcoming you to Austin Roots, a podcast about how Austin, Texas became flavored the way it is.
And this is Dr. Jason Mellard, a cultural historian, doing my best to connect the old and the new in this city we call home.
Or the center of the musical universe.
Danny Garrett is a visual artist central to Austin's music poster scene, a member of the Armadillo Art Squad, postering for the Armadillo World headquarters in the 1970s. He's also closely associated with the blues venue Antone's and with specific iconic works for Willie Nelson and Stevie Ray Vaughan. He's produced graphic design for film and tech and has taught at Austin Community College and the Auckland University of Technology. Many of these experiences are collected in his memoir, Weird Yet Strange, Notes from an Austin Music Artist. Welcome, and thanks for joining us today, Danny.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
So, like a lot of folks we've been talking to, you're a Texan who's raised somewhere other than Austin. Can you tell us a little bit about where you're from and what some of your earliest musical and cultural influences were?
Okay, I wasn't born in Texas. I was certainly raised here. I was born in Dodge City, Kansas. My father was stationed there during World War II, and that's where I was born. I grew up till I was 7, about 17 miles east of Waco in a little town called Mart, Texas, and then moved to the coast and basically finished growing up in Lake Jackson, Texas, near Freeport. Really, the earliest musical influences I can remember came from that area, southeastern corner of Texas, which was very, very rich in country and western blues and zydeco. Picked up a lot of that from the Houston radio stations that we listened to in Lake Jackson. Bobby Blue Bland was probably one of my first musicians that I was passionate about. He was very big in that area in the late 50s, early 60s, and a lot of the local bands that we used to go to around there, such as Roy Head and the Traits and B.J. Thomas and the Triumphs. They all covered Bobby Blue Bland songs, mostly from the album Two Steps from the Blues. Though I picked up some other influences when I would go back up to Central Texas, where the curvature of the earth allowed us to hear Randy's Record Store and Ernie's Record Mart out of Gallatin, Tennessee. That sort of reinforced all the rhythm and blues that I was hearing down in Lake Jackson. Anyway, those are among my earliest influences. The first person I ever saw in concert was Ray Charles in 1958. So again, it's all fairly consistent.
Yeah, that's a good one to start with, Ray Charles in 58. What about in terms of visual arts? It's sort of something you came to a little bit later. Is there imagery or art from your youth, pop culture or high arts that you can remember?
My first influences in art were probably comic books and cartoons. The first things I drew were like Bugs Bunny and Woody Woodpecker and stuff like that. The real influence came when I discovered Mad. When I discovered Mad, it wasn't Mad Magazine, it was Mad Comics from the EC brand. I was heavily influenced by their artists such as Will Elder, Jack Davis, and Wallace Wood. I really wasn't captured by art till I actually became an artist. I set out to be a historian, got a degree in history from Stephen F. Austin, and got one semester into that when I was drafted. Went to Vietnam in '69, was sort of radicalized by that experience, and that kind of killed any thought of going back to history as a profession, and I became an artist.
You have your own plans, but then the U.S. government had other plans for you. And Vietnam cast such a large shadow over all of this culture and politics that we're talking about in the 60s and the 70s. How do you see Vietnam's role in your larger life story? I think you've kind of touched on that a little bit. It's seen as a radicalizing experience. Do you think that that was a common experience for people you served with or knew later in Austin?
Certainly some of the people I connected with later, it was in Austin and elsewhere, but I was pretty much an old man when I went to Vietnam. I was 24. Most of the people I served with were teenagers. I think I can safely say that if you're in combat, you're radicalized by the experience because it's such a radical experience. It seems inconceivable to me that you would not be. It was the biggest event in my life. Of course, it's carried a lot of influence over the years. I was caught up in the temper of the times. I'm very much anti-war even when I was in Vietnam. And so I came back here to find, and join the counterculture when I got out of the Army in March of 1970, was enthusiastic about being in the counterculture and enthusiastic about most of the causes that it took up, such as the anti-war cause, general progressive equality issues. When I came to Austin, I fit right into all that. I came here from Houston, and of course, the countercultural scene here was much stronger than it had been in Houston. I was happy to join it immediately.
Eddie, in the Armadillo World headquarters, was it notable or noticeable? Is it something that you kind of knew who had served?
Most of the shuttle bus drivers around the campus were veterans. They had a tendency to go on strike a lot because they were paid next to nothing, and they had a lot of responsibility, and they were working for someone who was making incredible amounts of money. My first experiences with Vietnam veterans at the Armadillo was giving benefits to raise awareness and funds, and we dearly loved our veterans because they could drink beer, and we really ripped them off at 25 cents a cup. We were trying to raise money for the veterans, but the veterans could nevertheless spend more money than most of our regular customers.
Retrospect and public memory, it's often held that the pro-war and anti-war positions, that the veterans had a particular place in a conscription army and in the draft. It's a very diverse set of people with diverse sets of backgrounds that upon coming back, they plug themselves in all different kinds of ways. And the counterculture is no different.
Was Armadillo ever off limits?
Armadillo was always off limits. I first met some of the principals of the Vulcan Gas Company. I worked for the United States Brewers Association. I was the youngest person ever hired by the oldest trade association in America. Once a month, they had meetings, the Armed Forces Disciplinary Control Boards, and Texas was divided up into about 5 districts. There were only 4 of us in the office for the USBA, and whoever was closest to the meeting at Fort Hood or in deep South Texas or West Texas or Austin would go to those meetings, and there would be generally 30 or so people associated with anything having to do with the health, welfare, or morals of the troops. That was, of course, all the beer joints, especially around Fort Hood, where all the VD contacts were reported to come from. I was 23, I believe. I was being sent up and down South 8th Street in Temple to talk to these 60-year-old madams and asked them to please keep the prostitution out of their beer joints. All they could do to just keep from laughing in my face. But I took it real serious.
Danny, you say you came here from Houston. Now, when you did that, were you joining people you already knew here? Was it something about the counterculture that drew you? What were your introductions to the art and music scene in Austin?
Nothing culturally dramatic or anything like that. One weekend I came up to Austin. It was in early spring of 71. Just spent the night in Austin and went to Enchanted Rock. Had a good time there, which was the purpose of our trip from Houston. And then came back and spent another night in Austin. Although my experience was kind of a glancing blow at that point, really took hold. About 6 weeks later, I dropped out of school at the University of Houston and moved up here. I just felt a calling to come here. No big sacrifice to leave Houston.
Now, in terms of your coming into the Austin counterculture, Danny, how did you get into the poster art crowd? There's a whole sort of narrative that's already ongoing sort of in 71 when you show up and you flow right into that stream. And I was wondering sort of what your introduction there was.
Well, when I came to Austin, the intent at that time was I'd gotten back into my art. I was still trying to finish my master's in history, but that didn't work out either at the University of Houston or University of Texas. Anyway, the idea was to work on an underground comic book. I started that in Houston, and I brought it up with me. And one of the first things I did when I got to Austin was, of course, go to Willie's to check out the underground comic books. Jim Franklin had just published his Armadillo comics, so I became aware of him, found out he was living at the Armadillo, and I'd been there a couple of times to listen to music, so I went to see Jim to ask him for some insight on doing an underground comic. And went up to his upstairs studio there, living quarters. He was working on a Mother Earth poster, but he was assigned to do a John Sebastian poster, which he didn't want to do. So he looked at my art and asked asked me if I would like to do that poster. And he picked out a pen and ink piece I did, which was sort of a cosmic woman thing. He said we could use that as the basic art, and you can do the lettering. I'll show you how to cut acetate overlays for the color separations, and you can do a poster. And so I did. And it was the John Sebastian poster, which Eddie can probably tell you a big story about that.
A disaster for Armadillo.
I know it was. Anyway, I got my feet wet, and that sort of hooked me. I found that I was much more attracted to drawing pictures than I was to hanging sheetrock. So a couple of people wanted me to do logos. I did it, and I had the good fortune to do some more posters for Armadillo, and that's kind of how it started.
Yeah, that John Sebastian show, that was a big name and a big get, right? But it didn't quite turn out as y'all planned.
It was the first huge mistake that I made. I was, desperate. I didn't have anybody's phone number. How do I, just stumbling through booking agents. And John Sebastian had been in the Woodstock movie or something. I don't remember. I got sold a bill of goods, and you would just multiply the ticket price by the number of people that you were going to have, and you always overestimated the number of people. I never overestimated so bad again. Nobody showed up.
All right, we can put John Sebastian behind us. The Armadillo poster artist scene through Jim Franklin, who was the art director early, Michael Priest kind of taking over those duties a little bit later. Let's talk about the Armadillo Art Squad. In some ways, you're here as a representative for them as a whole as well. Who's in the Armadillo Art Squad? What were they like?
Well, there were a lot of people that did posters for the Armadillo. I would say the nucleus of the art squad, I'm not going to try to leave anybody out, but I'm sure I will. Of course, Jim Franklin, Ken Featherston, Michael Priest, Guy Juke, Sam Yates, Bill Narum, Carry On, Jack Jackson, Henry Gonzalez, Gary McElhaney. Those are the ones that immediately come to mind.
Jack Jackson had already moved on. I always think of it as 7 people. And Directions Company. Were you ever involved with Osborne and the Directions Company?
I was, but just briefly. It seemed like they came and went so fast.
Yeah.
I worked with Michael. And, of course, the big tragedy was, the loss of Ken from the art squad.
Oh, yeah.
Anyway, it was my great pleasure and honor to be among that group of artists. Since I had studied history in my university years, only a couple of art classes, these guys, especially Guy Juke, Michael Priest, and Bill Narum from Schenough Studios, these guys were my art education. That's how I, learned how to draw and create these posters.
Did you ever notice that there were a lot of artists who were also history majors? Gilbert Shelton?
Yes, I did.
Jack Jackson?
Oh, yes.
A lot of the artists were deep, serious history scholars.
Oh, yes, especially Jackson. He was just awesome. And of course, he was a master cartographer. They all had an acute sense of history, whether they delved into it directly or not.
A lot of them mined that history visually, like especially the extent to which American West iconography comes across in a lot of your work. It's often, there are like historic photographs that are recognizable that are used in some way in some of those posters. I know you have one with Quanah Parker comes to mind.
Yeah, the one that had Quanah Parker, that's probably the rarest poster. The Quanah Parker image that I used was in a rare Willie Nelson poster I did. He was doing a concert in Big Spring in support of the Comanche Trail Amphitheater, which is how Quanah Parker comes to figure in that, because he was the last Comanche chief. Willie was doing this in support of Clifford Antone, who was in the marijuana bust, and as part of his community service, he was arranging concerts. That was the poster that had Quanah Parker. Another poster I did for the same thing was Stevie Ray Vaughan in Double Trouble and the Thunderbirds, which was another poster I did for another concert Clifford put on.
So as distinctive as each of your styles are in the Armadillo Art Squad, are there also commonalities? Like, do you see this as kind of a school of poster art in any way? Carry On's style is very different than Guy Jukes, but there's also sometimes you can kind of see overlaps.
In my opinion, I definitely see a school there. I think we fed off of each other. We certainly had a common pool of Texas Western and music iconography that we tapped into over and over again. And I do believe that it was a unique approach to music ephemera and music art that was established here that very definitely constitutes a school. We took a lot of our cues from the art that Franklin and Gilbert Sheldon had done back in the 60s. Then we added our own chops to it. And you're correct. I mean, there's a lot of different styles.
And Juke had several of his own.
Oh, God, yes. I mean, Juke is probably the most innovative designer and creator of motifs that I've seen. Back in the 80s, there was something on public access TV. It was about a 30-minute little documentary that showed Austin posters and played music over it. Well, some of what we did was so similar to one another that some of my posters got in with Juke, some of Juke's posters got in with Priest. Some of them were so close in concept they were confused with others.
Every time I think I'm getting slick and I can really tell the difference, I still get tricked quite a bit. There is like a very distinctive style that sometimes each of you works in, but it's also obvious your cross influences, right? So that sometimes one of you does a poster that seems almost like it's in someone else's style, both in tribute and in cross influence.
I was just going to say, of course, there are a lot of jams that we did together that we worked on together. I still have problems going in to see some of those jams, say between Franklin and Priest or Juke and Priest. Sometimes I get the elements wrong, and I'm very familiar with the stuff.
So, Eddie, can you tell us a little bit about how you saw the role of the poster artists in the Armadillo and what the process was like of getting those made for a show?
Well, the process was like skinning an animal that didn't want to be skinned some of the time. Everybody wanted to work. They worked so well among themselves. I was amazed at how they passed off work from one to the other. And sometimes it was, nobody wanted to do the lettering. Everybody wanted to draw the pictures, but Jim Franklin hated lettering. He resented the name of the place, Armadillo World Headquarters. That many letters that he had to do over and over again. He just despised me for it. It was quite a good gang of compatriots. It was hard to know who was going to be available for what. When the whole thing started, I was not aware of anybody but Jim Franklin. And then poof, Jim Franklin was gone just immediately. He left for Europe with Freddie King. Mike Osborne walked up with Mike Priest and said that he had a new advertising agency and Mike Priest was one of his artists and he was available, to do posters. In Jim Franklin's absence, very first thing I said was I need a Willie Nelson poster. His first show was coming up. The only time I ever suggested what anybody might put on a poster. And I said, just give me an old cowboy crying into his beer, standing at a bar with a jukebox behind him singing Hello Walls. And he did all of that with Willie's portrait up in the corner and was back the next day with it. I don't know where he got all the speed that he must have used to do all of those little hash marks, but he didn't get enough sleep. Might have cost him some of his shelf life in the end. But I never even hinted again at what I might want to see because I knew it'd never exceed that one.
That is a personal favorite. I'm still kind of hunting around for that one, that first Michael Priest, Willie Nelson, the jukebox crying in the beer. It's a perfect one. Danny, your iconic poster, you're assigned or choose a show, an artist.
It was like Eddie said, most of the venues left it up to us to do. Certainly Armadillo did. And the work for Willie Nelson, I was free to come up with whatever I wanted. Castle Creek, Austin Opry House, Texas Opry House, Austin Opera House, all of those, I pretty much had a lot of latitude. The only restriction I had on doing it was the work I did for Antone's. Clifford insisted that it be a portraiture of the artist and that it be respectful. Some of the whimsical stuff I did, say for Amazing Rhythm Aces that I did for the Armadillo, would not fly with Clifford. A lot of times I would look to see what sort of albums were out at the time and build a poster around that. Best example I think of that is the Los Gonzo poster that I did for the Armadillo, which has the 4 white horses in it, and that came directly from the album cover for their first LP that they put out. Basically recreated the album cover cover there, with the tornado as the centerpiece and 4 horses fleeing. Each of those 4 horses represents one of the members of the band. At that time, it was Bob Livingston. He's the lead horse with the flower in his mouth. There's Gary P. Nunn. He's the horse that's running off to the side because Gary P. Nunn would occasionally leave the band and come back to the band. And then behind him is John Inman to the right of the poster, who is the lead guitarist, and bringing up the rear is Paul Piercy, the drummer. So a lot of times a poster would be created around an album cover or some sort of other significant event or occurrence or product associated with the band. Could be very eclectic sometimes.
I stomped on some feelings a couple of times real early on and insisted that it was very important that people be able to read where, when, who, and how much. And those elements, that was what we were trying to sell. I was amazed at some of the psychedelia coming out of the San Francisco poster scene because I couldn't make heads or tails of any of it. If they can't read enough to tell when they're supposed to be there and how much money they were supposed to bring, then it wasn't doing us any good.
Yeah, some of those San Francisco works, they are kind of confounding, and then that bleeds over into a lot of Gilbert's work for the Vulcan. It's just brilliant in terms of its lettering, but it doesn't, it's not communicative. Didn't someone say that there was the rule was that you needed to be able to read it, driving by a telephone pole?
Almost everything's been said one time or another.
Yeah, I think Priest made that comment at one point in time. The San Francisco posters sort of resonated with everybody, and I mean, everyone across the country, across the world. Of course, there was a very strong connection between Austin and San Francisco. There was a direct feedback from that, from what was going on in San Francisco, especially with Gilbert out there and Jackson out there. There was a resonance, but it wasn't the same thing. Approaches were very different. Anyway, I think the success of the San Francisco posters sort of drove the other poster scenes here and elsewhere.
Now, in terms of your other poster works, I suppose I should start by asking you if there are particular ones that you would like to talk about.
Well, of course, I've got a couple of iconic pieces. The Willie Nelson Uncle Sam piece, the first Muddy Waters, call it Bust of Muddy that I did for Clifford, the Sleep at the Wheel poster I did for Antone's, and my personal favorite is the one I did with Willie Nelson and Quanah Parker for Clifford's benefit in Big Springs that hardly anybody in this town has ever seen.
Yeah, those are some of the ones that I was interested in talking about too. Maybe we could start with the Asleep at the Wheel for Antone, because I think it's actually an interesting bridge between the Armadillo and Antone's worlds.
That was done for Antone's second incarnation, which was on Great Northern Boulevard. It was in an old furniture warehouse, and the space was pretty generous for seating people, but it was terrible for sound. It was all flat surface. The sound was only good when the place was filled with people. Anyway, Clifford had done almost exclusively at the downtown club blues, rhythm and blues, and Zydeco. When he moved to the second location up on Great Northern Boulevard, Clifford added a lot of progressive country and traditional country act.
Blues guys wouldn't fill it up, and so he had to go for larger acts. I went to the Jerry Lee Lewis show. One of the biggest surprises of my life was discovering Virginia from Virginia's Cafe in that crowd of people, and she had come to see Jerry Lee Lewis and bring him a pie.
Would the Ray Price and George Jones also be at the Great Northern?
I completely spaced out Ray Price poster. Of course, he was very definitely traditional country. And Eddie's right, it was a survival thing, and Clifford was booking those acts to put people in seats so he could continue Antone's. That location, I think, only existed for about 7 or 8 months, and then they moved to the third and probably the most popular location in terms of who played there and attendance, which was at 29th and Guadalupe.
And it's a venue that you had a fairly close relationship with. So in addition to being a part of the Armadillo Art Squad, of those artists, you're the one who's most associated with Antone's, which opens in 1975 as a distinctive blues venue. Can you tell us a little bit about your history with that club, your relationship with Clifford Antone?
I, of course, was almost exclusively freelancing then, as were most of my colleagues. Some of them had resident gigs. Some of us didn't. Some of us went from venue to venue. And I can just remember I heard of Antone's opening down there, and I went down there, ran into Clifford and met him, asked him if he needed artwork, and he said he needed a logo. So I came up with it in 1975. That was also the same year I did the logo for the Texas Chili Parlor. And then I just started working with Clifford on individual posters. The first one I did for him was a Clifton Chenier piece, then a couple more downtown. The downtown location at 6th and Brazos was where most of the magic went down. That's where you had the interaction between the aging blues guys from Chicago, Kansas City, New Orleans, and elsewhere, and then the young white guys that were playing the blues here in town. Jimmy
That's
Vaughan.
where Bob Skaggs got knocked out.
Yes. I can remember the picture of him laying on the concrete that was in the Austin Sun at the time, and it said the caption was "Bob Skaggs laid back in Austin." He was trying to rush the door to get upstairs to see Muddy, I think, and one of Clifford's security was having no part of it. That's where, Stevie and Albert King got together. And all these relationships, like between Derek O'Brien and Albert Collins, it was just such an incredible place to see that kind of tradition passed not only from generation to generation, but from race to race.
Yeah, it's an important chapter in the history of Chicago blues in some sense, and that there are all these perennial blues revivals, and Antone's seems to be a link in that chain. It kept some of those older artists, and not just the big names, but the people who were their backup band, session musicians. Clifford was interested in booking all of them and giving them their due. It's also where one of your iconic images, the first Muddy, I guess both of your Muddies are iconic. I would say that when I think of your poster art, either that Muddy or that Willie are two of the first ones that come to mind. Can you tell us a little bit about the Muddy Waters bust poster that you did?
A lot of the pieces I did from photographs, very incredible photographs from very incredible photographers. That particular one was a Watt Casey photograph. He graciously allowed me to use it. It's one of my best pieces. The lettering I just made up. And if you'll notice in that lettering, there's a playing card. There's an ace in there. And I started using a playing card motif for a lot of the posters that I did. The aces tended to be blues greats who had passed on. The queens, of course, were the female blues players that were current. The jacks were up-and-coming blues musicians. And then I used the numbered cards on various posters to indicate the year. The last time I did that was the Antone's 21st anniversary, which had Stevie on it. Because it was the 21st, I used an ace and a jack for 21. Clifford always insisted that it honor somebody who had died. And of course, this was about 4 years after Stevie's death, and Albert Collins had died the year before, and that's who Clifford wanted me to put on there. And the Antone's 21st poster was the last year, or the next to the last year, at the Guadalupe Street location. At that point in time, it didn't look like Antone's was going to continue. So I petitioned Clifford the first time I ever did to put Stevie on the poster instead of Albert, and if this was going to be the last poster, that it should honor Stevie, because Stevie was really what the club was all about. And he relented. If you look on the poster, they're still dedicated to Albert Collins and other people, but Stevie got the portrait piece on that. And of course, the poster itself was printed by the great Terry Raines, who printed a lot of these posters and was one of the best printers to ever come out of this town.
Eddie, can you tell us a little bit about how did Antone sort of fit into the Armadillo story?
Gosh, I knew about the family sandwiches before I met Clifford. He had a sandwich shop up here. I was flabbergasted. This guy's got to be absolutely crazy if he's going to try to run nothing but blues. And I was at that time scuffling. I would have done anything, Tibetan belly dancers, anything to get butts in the seats. And here's the guy who's going to do the whole thing with blues. I just thought he was absolutely nuts. But immediately learned to love him and how much passion he had for doing what he set out to do. We had already some great relationships with some noteworthy blues acts, and we didn't ever really step on each other's toes. He wasn't interested in any kind of rivalry and certainly wasn't interested in old gut bucket blues like Mance Lipscomb. And he was really lucky that he didn't bite on some of the bad fish I did with that, like the Etta James tour. We had to book her for 3 nights to get the price reasonable, and then she went to San Antonio and got busted for heroin between 2 of those shows. We got along great. And when he started booking Sleep at the Wheel, and that sort of divergence from his only the blues, always the blues, I understood exactly why. He just needed to put butts in seats. Clifford and I had a good relationship starting back then. If I happened to show up, if I would escape Armadillo to hide out a little bit at his place, he just treated me like his favorite uncle. He was a mighty sweet guy and passionate right out to the edge of the ledge about what he was trying to do.
And I think that hiding out worked both ways. I think the first time that I sat down and talked to Clifford Antone was actually at a Threadgill's Christmas party, right? It wasn't at Antone's.
Well, by the time I got out of the raw deal and started Threadgill's, Clifford and I were inseparable buddies because, if you could feed somebody like a portion size called Clifford, rather than a slice of meatloaf out of the meatloaf pan, you took a small statue and turned it up this way. Clifford could put away some chow, and that's how we lost him, I'm afraid. His heart was bigger than his head. God bless him.
He taught a class at UT and at Texas State and was able to share what he knew with some younger generations there towards the end, too. For people who might not know this history of Antone's, that it had these, I'm going to say 6. I think in my mind, I can picture 6 of them. I'm just going to kind of work through them a little bit, right? So Antone starts in 75 on 6th Street at a time when it's one of the first sort of modern nightlife spaces on 6th, right? So the Ritz had already started.
When the Austin music scene started, there was just a few venues, and then, of course, the music exploded, and they called for more venues. There was even an idea that there should be an entertainment district. Castle Creek was north of the river, and the Lions Wagon Yard, and of course Antone's, and 6th Street was being looked at. Back then it was basically kind of a skid row with Huto bars, pawn shops, loan establishments, and repair garages, and all sorts of things. And then the clubs started going in down there. The first one I can remember locating there, the first music venue I can remember, was called Toad Hall, and it was in the basement of what later was the Paradise at 6th and Trinity, I believe. And Gordo's Billiards came in down there, and the Ritz. Clifford set up his blues club in 75, and that was one of the first ones down there. And of course, the second location was at Great Northern Boulevard off of Steck, and the third location was at 29th and Guadalupe. The fourth location was back downtown at 5th and Lavaca. The fifth location.
Tenure on Riverside, is that right?
Yes. Very brief, but it was notable for having this big, huge portrait of Clifford in black and white on the side of the building.
And now, it's still in this environment with Austin real estate struggling to stick around, but the downtown location with the new ownership group that includes Gary Clark Jr., among other people, carrying that tradition forward with plenty of your posters still on those walls. Am I right to think that a lot of people think of the 29th and Guadalupe as sort of the classic Antone's location, maybe in part because it is the one that is there when Stevie Ray Vaughan and the Thunderbirds are kind of cresting in terms of their national and international reputations?
This is just a personal perspective. The 70s were largely about the progressive country, and the 80s was largely about blues. It was like, I think, 82, I believe, when the 29th and Guadalupe location started up, and then it continued until the mid-90s. So, yeah, I would say this is where most people had access to the blues product that Antone's was putting out. The building was a former Shakey's Pizza place, and at the time that Clifford acquired it, it was AJ's Roadhouse, which was a progressive country place. Clifford moved in there, and I can remember Dale Wilkins was changing the sign. He kept the A from AJ's and just added the NTONES. It was a good location. The problem was, space-wise, that it was a Shakey's corporate franchise location. They put in a central freezer, which had load-bearing walls. The kitchen was behind that. The dining area was in front. When Antone's operated there, that whole kitchen area, which was a significant amount of square footage, you couldn't seat anybody there because the bar wrapped around the freezer. So the whole time, that space behind it, when it was Shakey's, was the kitchen prep area. Everybody congregated back there. The general public didn't know much about it. But that was the one shortcoming of that particular location. But that was the one I think that people most accessed and remember Antone's for. And it was because of Stevie Ray, Thunderbirds, the Cobras, and Lou Ann Martin.
Yeah, and you did some of the big Stevie Ray Vaughan work around that time when Stevie Ray Vaughan was becoming this international icon. You were doing some of that iconography in some ways. I think the lettering on the logo there, is that yours?
Yes, it is. And it was appropriated by Chesley Milliken, I think, when he was managing Stevie. He acquired that lettering for his own purposes.
What was it like seeing Stevie Ray come up in this scene? He's someone who is intertwined with it from the origins of the countercultural scene in the late 60s. You know, Jimmy came down first. What was it like having the perspective of sort of knowing him as a kid on the scene or a younger person on the scene and then watching him go where he went?
It's a fascinating story because he was, the kid brother that came down and joined his older brother and the other magnificent Dallas blues players, Derek O'Brien, Denny Freeman, Alex Napier, Paul Ray. He was the kid. I can remember the first time I saw him play was a rainy night at Antone's on 6th and Brazos, probably about 76. There were more employees than patrons. It was just Stevie playing with a drummer and a bass player and essentially playing for himself. That was the first time I saw him, and I was impressed. The blues as a musical genre in particular has its seasons. Clifford opened up Antone's. The blues season was maybe in its spring because all the attention that the blues had gotten from the British invasion validated the blues again and pushed it into a new season of growth. When the Thunderbirds were playing, the Cobras and then Stevie sort of went into its summer, and then with the death of Stevie, it sort of went fallow again into a fall and winter season. It'll come back around. The Austin blues players were largely responsible for keeping it alive during the 80s and 90s.
Yeah, and I mean, Antone's, it's so well known as a kind of a training ground in a school, and it wasn't just that initial, the Chicago blues to, these younger counterculture Austin blues men, but then they also passed it on, like going through into the 90s and the 21st century, people like Gary Clark Jr., even the Exiles, Peterson brothers, right? Those were sort of the last graduating class that Clifford himself would have known. And then even today, someone like Jackie Vinson, who's been making a lot of noise and a name for herself over the past year or so, is kind of in some ways the next chapter of that blues guitar in this town. So Stevie Ray Vaughan is one artist that you had kind of a front row seat for. Another artist that your visual work is closely associated with is Willie Nelson. Can you tell us about your first Willie Nelson 4th of July poster and what it was like to work for the Willie Nelson organization on these commissions?
The first poster I did was for the second concert in 74. And then I did subsequent ones, 79, 80, and then I did the one riffing off the James Montgomery flag recruiting poster, which of course others have used quite extensively, not only me. But I did that in 83, and then it was used again 4 more times in different incarnations. But in 83, it was going to be, he was going to play 3 places, Atlanta, Washington, and New York City. Then again, it was used in the 80s, and then maybe once in the 90s. Working with the Willie organization, especially in the early days, was very challenging. Especially when you were doing music ephemera such as posters or t-shirt designs or so forth. And they ran a very tight ship, so it was impossible to get residuals or anything like that. But It's always been an honor to do work for Willie, even though working with his minions could be challenging. I'm prideful that I was able to do work for Willie and Stevie.
That Willie poster is an eternal one. You say ripping off of the flag, so it's Willie Nelson as Uncle Sam and kind of an I want you. Of course, like speaking as the way we are in art and appropriation, the flag image itself was a tribute to the British did that poster first in 1914.
Yes, they did. Lord Kitchener and John Bull pointing their fingers at you.
These things got to echo over time. These images and these sounds, they kind of live forever. And I'm glad that we can find and give credit where it's due when we can. Now, Eddie, in terms of the Willie Nelson story in Austin, Texas, I think a lot of that comes through the Armadillo World Headquarters. That's usually seen as the catalyst, that was a short but intense relationship, but was important for the both of you. Can you tell us a little bit about how the Armadillo World Headquarters and the Willie Nelson, how their paths converged for a short season?
Carefully, I can tell you very carefully. Willie's Live at Panther Hall album was one of Joe Brown's favorite albums. Joe Brown, who's another one of those guys that did a whole lot, doesn't get any credit for it, but he's worth a book and a movie. He was a hysterically funny guy and brilliant. But I went to California to try to stir up some business for the Armadillo and was sleeping on his sofa and woke up determined to get back home and find Willie Nelson and introduce him to our hippie audience at the Armadillo. We'd already started the beer garden and had the cabaret, torn out the walls and made the place bigger than it had been for that first year. And I was up on the cabaret and somebody behind me wanted to speak, and I turned around and this little guy said, "Hi, I'm Willie Nelson." And I said, "I've been looking for you." "Well, you just found me." And I said, "Well, I want you to play here." He said, "Well, I want to play here." And as they say, the rest is history. He played a couple of times. I think the first time we drew about 400 people, charged $1. It's that Priest poster. We can go back and find that poster and find out whether it's $1 or $2, I think. Willie was used to playing for the door, and I was used to booking people for 50% of the door. So that's probably where the rub started. He was so impressed with the audience the first time that he played that he immediately called Wayland and told Wayland to get your ass down here. You'll love this scene. And I've got on tape somewhere of Wayland, the first time he played, looking out and seeing that audience and turning around to his guitar player and saying, "Go find that little redheaded shit. Look what he's got us into." It scared the hell out of him, see all those hippies. And he was used to making a lot bigger guarantee, and the audience grew rapidly. No, he maybe played twice, and then when he saw the potential in that crowd of ours, he and Tim O'Connor immediately bought the old Opry House. They could make a whole lot more money if they didn't have to deal with me.
They had the added bonus of air conditioning, I believe, was one of their selling.
Carpet and air conditioning. Yeah, it was a huge place and flocked wallpaper. It was a whole different level. And so it didn't last long. The romance with Willie, and we got involved with the first picnic, and that's really where the story starts getting complicated. He had offered everybody in his gang $5,000 to help him promote that Dripping Springs show. He had seen the potential the year before when some sort of reunion.
Was it just the Dripping Springs reunion?
Yeah,
I believe so.
He had seen the potential there, and so he hired his buddies in Waco, going to get $5,000 for selling tickets in Waco. Somebody in Fort Worth, Gino McCausland. Oh, what a bad actor. Somebody in Houston. We were in his car driving out west of town, just past Soap Creek, and I told him I was really worried about what was going to happen out there. And he said, "Well, why don't you help me? I'll give you $5,000. So I got in a long line of people who were guaranteed $5,000 from Willie, and we pulled off that show because of Woody Roberts. Woody came up from San Antonio, and when we had a meeting at my house, and I introduced him, and he said, well, he could. He had just a couple of demands. He needed an office and a telephone, and he was looking to move from San Antonio to Austin and get involved with us anyway. He didn't have any confidence that we were going to be able to do it at all until Leon Russell joined the bill. The one catch was we couldn't advertise Leon. And so he said, well, every time you see somebody for a radio station, you just tell them that the rumor about Leon Russell and Bob Dylan being there is probably not true, and we're not endorsing that at all. And so we doubled up on the rumor and exploded it by adding Bob Dylan to it. Sure enough, a lot of people showed up. We were the only operation that got the $5,000. I do know that. Part of our team was the accountant, Randy McCall. We got our $5,000 before we turned over all of the money to Willie to spread it out among his friends however he chose to. And there was a lot of acrimony. It was about all I needed in the way of working with the country and Western. Two kinds of music, they said back then. There's country and there's Western. One kind of music business executive, and that was somebody you didn't want to work with. And we pulled back in-house immediately and tried to get out of that whole milieu. It was a scary bunch of characters. I learned a lot, saw a lot, and I made some wonderful friends. Jack Fletcher was one of my very serious pals. Jack drove the bus for Willie. At that time, it was a Winnebago. I remember we were leaving a place on the south side of Houston one night. We were somewhere in the neighborhood of Kemah. It was just starting to rain, and everybody got out of the rain and into the bus. Somebody came up and knocked on the window. Jack opened the window. There was a guy wanting to go with us, and he handed Jack something, two hands through the window. And as we got on down the road, Jack opened the coat pocket where the present had gone. It was filled with every shape and color of capsule and tablet you've ever seen. There's a massive amount of pills that had already gotten a few drops of water. You could tell was probably in danger of melting together. And he said, "Take what you want." And I said, "What is it?" He said, "I don't know. Sort through it and see." And it must have been 300 capsules and pills and whatnot of various kinds of prescription drugs. But anyway, he was on the outs pretty soon after that, and shortly after that, I was on the outs. It was fast and furious, and kind of a southwestern version of what I had read earlier. And my literary upbringing is kind of a Damon Runyon-esque sort of southwestern version. Had every kind of character involved that you could ever want to take home to mama. And I don't spend a lot of time thinking about it because I still get confused when I try to sort it out.
Bring it up by bits and pieces, I think.
Yeah.
So, Danny, in terms of the next chapters in the Armadillo Art Squad, once that had become kind of a center of creativity, there are a couple of other interesting developments later in the 70s and into the 1980s. Can you tell us a little bit about what Schenough Studios was as one of these sort of centers?
Well, Schenough Studios was the idea of Michael Priest, Sam Yates, and they did the initial setting up. Sam dropped out, and it was Michael. Michael set up the studio in the old State Laundry between 15th, 16th, Lavaca, and Guadalupe. Took up half a block, known officially as the Bone Building. Rented out to other artists, luthiers, jewelry makers, people of all sorts. It had a fur storage vault in it, which was a great sound stage and the location of many parties there. Schenough Studios itself, we had a lot of square footage. We had a copy camera that was donated by Gil Heidegger, an old Roberts copy camera. Film positives and film negatives could be shot there to be used for printing or screen printing. Initially, it was Michael Priest, Guy Juke, me, Dale Wilkins, and then later we were joined by Bill Narum, Robert Ekstrom, a few other people. 79 or 80. The Austin Chronicle moved in there with us, attracted mainly by the Roberts copy camera that we had. And so they could shoot all their film negatives for printing there, save them a bit of money. It was a hothouse of creativity all through the mid-late 70s and early 80s. And then it went away when the Bone Building got sold and torn down, I believe, maybe 83 or 84.
It had a wonderful smokestack. Austin's always been famous for having no industry, and the closest visual piece of industry that I can ever remember on the skyline was that one smokestack that stood up right there, and nobody knew what it was for. They just drove by. And it was also only 100 feet from Old Willie's.
Yeah, it wasn't very far. Block and a half, maybe. The smokestack, of course, came from the huge boiler. Actually, they put the boiler in and then built the building around the boiler. And the boiler was so huge, when it was decommissioned, it was cut up and scattered. And a huge cavern was created in the middle of the building where the boiler was. Half Price Books was there, Jack Brown Cleaners. For a brief period of time, it was also Schlotsky's Bakery. So we got to smell sourdough every day when we came to work.
So that's also so Capital Saddlery would have been right over there too?
Right there, Buck Steiner.
Yeah, it was down the street. Capital Saddlery was down the street. Thundercloud Subs.
Wow, it's like the sandwich district. You got Thundercloud, Slotsky's, and Antone's.
Yeah.
And then another one of these next chapters, but there was a relationship between some of these countercultural artists and some of the origins of the Austin tech scene in terms of origin systems. Is that right?
That's right. Now, that was another chapter. I had actually gone out to Acel Art Supply, which had a store on Bee Caves Road at that point in time. Anyway, I was out there getting some art supplies, and they had a recruiting poster up for Origin Systems that were looking for some artists, people with animation skills or cartooning skills or something like that. I was interested at that point in time. I was very interested in 3D modeling, which was computer graphics, and I was looking to learn more. And so I went out there and applied for the job and got it. Saw it was an opportunity for people that might want to do the same thing. And so I told Michael Priest and Bill Narum about it, and Sam Yates. They all joined and worked at Origin. So did Gary McElhaney. And for a very, very brief period of time, Jim Franklin, he was out there working with us. Franklin had the idea. Franklin's always got an idea. And his idea was to create an Armadillo computer game and maybe sell some original art to Richard Garriott. And so he came out there and he worked for a while, and he wasn't really into gaming and so forth, but he was with us briefly. Michael and Bill and I sort of left early on, and Sam Yates stayed and also joined other gaming companies. Eventually ended up with Walt Disney, its gaming division, and I think he worked there until around 2005. And Bill tried to start his own game company, Go-Go Studio. He did that for a while, and Michael and I eventually left. I think I quit the gaming business in like 97.
I remember finding it so interesting when I learned that, because I think in the sort of narrative of Austin, the Armadillo Austin and the tech Austin are often held as being, completely divorced from one another. But here we have this kind of creative through line. There's a chance that this is some of the first art of y'all's that I saw, because I grew up with Exodus Ultima and all of the artwork associated with it. And I'm sure that some of y'all have a fingerprint on some of that. This fills in a lot for me, realizing how Schenough fits into that little geography of those streets. So Schenough, Origin Systems, gaming. Danny, your long travels and travails still were going on quite a pace and took you even further afield. You have a chapter of your art life in New Zealand as well, and I'm curious what took you to the other side of the world.
I just hooked up with Kelly Smoot, who later became my wife, and we had decided after George W. Bush got reelected that this was the worst thing that could politically happen to this country. Little did we know. Anyway, we decided to immigrate to New Zealand, actually sight unseen. She got a job down there, and I accompanied her as her partner. When I got there, I was able to work. We were there on a work visa. I had been teaching art at ACC, so we met somebody down there, and I got an entree to Auckland University of Technology, and I got hired there and taught there for 5 years. And I was teaching traditional media, traditional illustration, drawing, painting, life drawing, and so forth. Because of my experience in the computer game industry, they were just farming up their digital graphic degree plan. And so I was one of the founding faculty members of that. I left it in 2010, but it's become the biggest digital graphic powerhouse in the Southern Hemisphere, mainly because they partnered up with Peter Jackson and Weta Studios down in Wellington. I came back because the economic downturn in 2008, my wife couldn't find work. and she was having to come back here to get contracts.
Well, as idyllic as it sounds, I'm glad something did bring you back home so we could have conversations like this one. Danny, do you have any recent or current projects that you've been excited about that you'd like to share with us in continuing your arts journey?
I guess the last big thing I did was the poster for the documentary on the Saxon Pub by Jeff Sandman called Nothing Stays the Same. It was significant in the sense that he wanted an old-style poster, and he was willing to actually pay for the amount of time it took to make it. So I did give him an old style, pen and ink with the spot color. That's about the last traditional poster I've done.
And the Saxon, for those listeners who are interested in the culture we're describing, it is one of those places where you can still step into this scene. Like, this scene still exists, in my mind, at the Saxon Pub and the music that goes on there.
Yeah, there's very few places. Saxon Pub, Continental Club, Sea Boys, Broken Spoke, Antone's. There may be a few more, but I'm hardly aware of them, especially after the trauma that 2020 has inflicted upon the Austin music scene. But I still try to keep my hand in it. Time to time, a client comes up and wants an old-style Austin music poster for old-style prices, and it's kind of hard to do that anymore. I can give them a digital poster for old-style prices, but they want old-style art. It's going to be fairly dear these days, especially hand lettering.
Thanks for joining us today, Danny. It was really enjoyable.
Yeah, good to see you, pal.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. Hope to see all you guys soon. Somewhere.
Thank y'all. Thank y'all. Austin Roots, executive produced by TSSI, produced by Renee O'Connor. Crybaby, courtesy of Jake Andrews Music. You need to get the memoir so you can get ready for the pop quiz. Go to threadgills.com and get Armadillo World Headquarters, a memoir. Do it now and do it right.